I feel like humbly believe that the best mastering engineers are capable of doing the two extremes, which is A, having a sound when necessary, and B, not having a sound when necessary.
Yes. And that's musical maturity as well that we've touched upon a few times. Is if you get something that already sounds so amazing and you don't need to do anything to it, you have to have that musical maturity to say, oh, hands off, I'm not going to do anything. Yeah. That said, most of what we get, there's room for us to be creative and to do our thing, but ultimately to serve the music in the best way possible. Right. It's never, I don't like to think that I have a sound, but I know I have a feel and I know I have a creative bent and I know I have a way of doing things that is probably somewhat unique to other people. But with all of that said, the concept is that I'm not trying to do it to impart my sound to something. It's my way of making an artist's record sound the best way it possibly can.
Totally.
And people come to us, I think, for that reason, for what I do and for what Bob does. They like it. And it's very respectful to the recording itself and always very respectful to, and I keep alluding to a musicality, but there's a lot to be said for staying very musical in what we do. And that sounds like, well, of course that's the case, but I don't know that that's always the case.
Yeah, I agree.
That's something that we work very hard at.
We're here with the rather wonderful Mr. Adam Ayan. How are you, my friend?
Well, thanks. How are you, Warren?
I'm good. I'm, how can I phrase it? I'm enjoying the cold weather.
Oh, I'm sure. You went from sunny Los Angeles to teens here. 16 degrees Fahrenheit this morning when I went out running. So,
what time were you going out running?
8-ish.
Oh.
And it was a balmy 16 degrees and then the wind picked up and it probably was more felt almost like single digits. So welcome to the frozen tundra of Portland, Maine.
It's nice. I mean, I've got, I can't really see, snowshoes on.
Yes.
Just in case. My wife made me wear snowshoes just in case. And to be honest, who knows? If we have a massive snowfall today or tonight, and I wake up in the morning, I'll feel blessed that I've got them.
Well, when I first had a look at the weather, knowing you were coming out at this time period, initially Saturday was going to be snow.
Right.
Tomorrow. And that has moved on. So all you're going to deal with, I think, here is very cold temps the next few days.
Okay.
Well, yeah. But that's what it's like in Maine in January.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I thought of all the times to pick, I'll come out in the height of the winter.
Next time you have to come visit us in the summer, just to get a feel for that as well.
Beautiful. So you're upstairs in Gateway. This is rather lovely.
I am, yes. It's a beautiful spot. This is my room here, which we converted as my mastering room in August of 2001.
Wow.
3 short years after I started here in August of 1998.
Wow, so that was still pretty early on, because when did this start running? Officially in 93?
Officially, doors opened in 93.
Yep.
And then I graduated college in 97, made my way here in August of 98. So 5 years down the line, I came along as a production engineer, and a few really wonderful opportunities opened up. First as Bob's assistant, which was an opportunity I really wanted and welcomed. And then shortly after that, him and I both realized I had the aptitude to master records. So by about some point in 2000, I started putting together my own clientele.
Wow.
Working in his room. And at some point, he's always busy. I started getting busy. We needed another space to master in. And we took this room, which had already been built to the same specs as his room, just in a smaller space, and converted it as my mastering room. And I've been working up here since then, since August 2001. And just a great place to be.
We were trying to figure out when I met you. I think it was 2008.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like about that ballpark. Yeah.
Because we were in the Uber coming from the airport late last night. I was talking to the Uber driver, and I said, "Oh yeah, it's been about 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years since I've been." Wow.
Time goes by fast, man. It really does. I always do that. I'm always like, I round it to 3 or 4 years. It's been 3 or 4 years. Yeah. And then when I give it anything like that, a hard thought, I'm like, it's been like 10 or 11 years.
Yeah. Absolutely crazy.
It is crazy.
Now, so 98, you had 5 years, then you were in this room in 2003. That's pretty...
2001, yes.
2001, sorry.
Within 3 years.
Wow.
Within 3 years. Yeah. And of course, in my early 20s, it couldn't happen fast enough, but I look back at it, and within 3 years, I was in this room mastering records. So
that's absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Congratulations.
I pinch myself every day still. So,
And so with it, how did you, because I'm sure people want to know this, how
Sure.
did you even get in contact with Bob and even get here and arrive here? What was how did that part?
That's a great question. So my initial contact with Bob was in 1996, my senior year at the University of Massachusetts. And we had an AES student chapter, of which I was the president of my senior year.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So the AES is such a great thing in so many ways. And as the president, my principal job was to ask industry professionals to come and speak on a monthly basis. We held once a month an AES student chapter meeting. And the concept was, who can we get to come and share their experiences with our students? So I reached out to a number of different people throughout the industry, but Bob I had known had been up here for about 3 years at that point. I went to the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, which is about a 2-hour drive from here. And I thought, well, he seems like a really gracious guy. He speaks at AES a lot, speaks at universities. I'll reach out to him and ask him if he'd be willing to come and give a talk for our student chapter. And he was willing to do it and gracious enough to make the trek down. So this was in 96, the early days of the internet. Also a time when even within the great sound recording program that I was involved in at UMass, we didn't have classes on mastering. Mastering is still a bit of a mystery to most people, even in the industry. So I started doing some early internet, Alta Vista, web crawler research as to what mastering was, which piqued my interest, thinking, oh, that sounds
Alta Vista.
like
I know
Alta
that name
Vista, right? So I did that research before he came because I didn't want to seem like a fool that didn't know anything about mastering and learned as much about it as I could. And in doing so, it piqued my interest as a career path. So he came and spoke for our AES chapter. I tried to do my final internship here to finish up the program, but we don't do internships here at Gateway, sorry to say. So I got turned down. And about a little over a year later, I heard from the director of our program at UMass that Bob was looking to hire a production engineer. So I emailed, faxed my resume, snail mailed my resume post haste, called to make sure they got it, and went through the process of interviewing for that position, of which I know a number of other folks interviewed, and I happened to be the lucky one that got it.
That's amazing.
So that's sort of it. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
And so it wasn't an internship. So it was actually paid.
It was actually paid, yes.
God bless you.
I've never, I'll take that back. I did one unpaid internship, which was because it was part of the program, the sound recording program. I had to do a 16-week internship, which I did at a mastering studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A place called MWorks, Jonathan Weiner's place.
So you did get to experience what it was like to be in a mastering studio.
I did, yes.
Well, that's a good part of the story, though, because that probably helped when you're sitting there. You know, you can say that you did a 16-week internship at a mastering studio.
Right. I mean, I knew a lot of the things that I was being hired to do here as a production engineer, I had done over that course of that 16 weeks. And after I had finished that 16-week internship, I was hired part-time to work at that mastering studio.
Right.
Also, prior to all of that, including prior to my stint as the president of the AES student chapter, I was working at a small multi-track studio my senior year of college. So I started making a living in studios when I was about 20 years old. Right. And only did that 16-week internship unpaid because that was part of the deal, with the program. Sure. So when the position opened up here, as I said, I had already been doing all of that kind of work in Boston. And so when I came here to interview, I knew about Sonic Solutions, which was our workstation of choice back in the day. I knew about doing quality control, which was a big part of the job. Listening to every final master before it got sent out for replication. Well,
I think that's the thing. And the reason why, this is good pause if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind at all.
I've been in a million mastering studios where there's a 20-something sitting doing this.
Yeah.
And that's frankly because the 20-something still has the highest possible high end. And so they're sitting there, there can be a lot of QC done, but when it gets to that 22-year-old, they're also going to hear like, oh, what is that? I heard like a 12K distortion, I
feel as though I still hear those things as well.
Yeah, I don't mean it like that, but I'm just saying like.
But it's a perspective thing as well, and they do it with headphones.
Exactly.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I had a kid working for us, and we had an album mastered, and I'm not going to say which album it was, but there was a 12K tone in it.
There was, no kidding.
Yeah.
It wasn't what I did for you, right? So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is helping you much. No,
You put me on the hot spot here.
somebody else had mastered it, and it was faint.
Right.
But you weren't with us when this happened. Eric wasn't with us, and it was faint, and I'm like, I can just about hear it. Oh yeah, and it was super, super faint, but he had caught it.
Okay.
And then in Pro Tools, if you do return spacebar, it plays at half speed.
Half speed.
And I'm telling you, when there's a 6K woo, going, you're like, you can hear it, like,
yeah, piercing.
yeah. And we were a little bummed. First of all, we were happy that he found it.
Oh, where did it come from? Can you tell me?
Came from an SSL.
Ah, okay.
I won't say who it was that was mixing because it's not their fault. But so it
wasn't the mastering house or mastering engineer. It came from the mix.
Mastering engineer didn't spot it though. And nor did his QC person. Engineer. Again, no, not naming artist, not naming record, not naming anybody, not naming the mixer, but the person. No gender. Kim is really mysterious. The person who mixed it on an SSL console at a studio, and we actually eventually found out that the monitor in the console had this 12K tone.
And it was bleeding into the audio.
It was bleeding into it, yeah. You remember when you were kids and you get that kind of like, you turn on the TV and you get this beep, kind of like really high pitched.
Yep.
And when you're a kid, it kills you and your parents barely notice.
Right.
You know, because 12K when you're like 11 is
pretty loud, yeah.
Pretty loud and painful.
Yeah.
And to your parents, you're like, oh yeah, I can hear it, but it's fainter as you get older. So anyway, cut a long story short, we didn't notice it on the mix.
Okay.
However, when we came to, the song got used in a really big movie.
Okay.
So we had to stem it. So he stemmed it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was 12K at like minus blah, blah, blah dB. So here's your 12K tones printing here. There's the signal. Now it's now being compounded like
for each stem.
Each stem.
Right.
So when it got put together and it was mastered as a whole,
it became obvious.
Became really, really obvious.
Yeah.
And so anyway, long story, but it's definitely interesting because it does point to, you know, and I remember working with a mixer, and I heard some like digital pops, and he looked over to his guy running Pro Tools, and he's like, "Oh yeah, there's digital pops there," and you know that there's a sort of reality. I think, especially for maybe on the engineering production, especially on the musician side, because you're listening so much louder, especially musicians.
Right.
When you're on stage and you're being...
Well, because you're used to having giant amplifiers pushing lots of sound pressure level and a certain feeling that you don't get over speakers unless you really crank them up, right?
Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the things you had asked about how I had met Bob and that sort of, in a nutshell, how I ended up here. When I interviewed, and Bob has done this a number of times for anybody that he's hired over the years, and I wasn't expecting this. The day I interviewed, had a great interview, saw the studio, chatted with Bob and his wife Gail, who's our studio manager. And before I was leaving, Bob said, "Oh, I do this QC test with everybody. Do you want to do that now?" Oh, wow. Sure. I'm not going to say no, of course not. And what he had for the QC test is you have to sit just like you would when you're doing QC as a production engineer, sit with headphones, notate everything you heard that should be notated and otherwise checked out against source mixes, possibly fixed or left alone, but certainly notated before it would get to manufacturing. And the album itself was already very organic, had a lot of pops, clicks, noises, otherwise. But Bob also booby-trapped it with some other things, including a 10K tone, an 8K tone, maybe a 12K, I don't recall. And he knew, you know, what everything was. So that was part of the test, so to speak, in the interview process, was sitting down and listening to this record and noting everything. And I think I got about 95 or 98% of the things.
Did he give you any instruction?
No, other than, you know, notate everything you hear that could be an anomaly, distortions, clicks, pops. And again, having that leg up, having interned and worked at MWorks with Jonathan Weiner previously, that's what I was doing day in and day out. So that was a good leg up for me, and that, oh, this is like what I do. You know, this is my job already. So I you know, had that experience already. Sure. I could imagine if I hadn't had that experience, I'd be like, oh gosh, what am I supposed to be doing here? But I already knew what what he was looking for.
But I think it's important to note, because I know exactly what you're saying. You can't, to get a job like this, you've got to have both of the aspects. But the most important aspect, first of all, is like, can I actually be around this guy for any period of time?
Sure.
I think that's something that always gets lost. And I think it's something that I had a hard time when I was coming up in the industry as a little, snot-nosed little kid, with my issues that I had to deal with as a kid, evolving. The same thing we're talking about, as a performer and everything. Is that maybe there was another kid who got 100 of it right. Maybe if you'd only got 50% rather than 95%, he still may have hired you because he may have thought, well, I can teach him this. Exactly. Because he's a personality that's teachable. Yep. I think being teachable, being able to learn is huge, because I don't remember who said it, but to paraphrase, something like, you cannot teach, you can only learn.
Right. Now,
obviously that's an oversimplification and not entirely true, but the idea of it's really, really important. So I just want to throw that out there, because I know what you're saying, and I want to make sure that
I'm glad you said it, because I agree with you 100% on that. Personality is such a huge aspect of it. I like to say that I have the temperament for mastering, and that means a number of different things.
Right.
But certainly starting out, having the temperament to be able to sit and listen for long periods of time. And then when Bob and I started working hand in hand, where I was his assistant, I think I had a temperament and probably an alchemy of the two of us. We just built a great rapport pretty quickly. And that's huge, because if you come in and we've all seen people in this industry that are like that don't have, and I don't mean great personalities, you have to be bubbly and exuberant. I just mean, as you're saying, being teachable, being able to learn, being naturally curious, also having a huge level of emotional intelligence. I recall I read the book Emotional Intelligence when I was about 21 years old, and that opened my mind to a lot of different things in terms of how your demeanor should be in life in general, and like that. And all of those things are very empowering and very powerful. And yes, much like we were talking about drummers earlier, hiring the drummer that best serves the song, you'd hire the engineer that best serves the situation. Sure. And the aptitude, as long as they have the aptitude and the right personality and the right mentality.
Yeah, I think of, and it's interesting because, talking to Bob and realizing his mentor was like my indirect mentor, because my mentors, especially since coming to America, are guys like, Jack Douglas and Shelley Yakus. And they would say their mentor, like Bob's, would have been Phil Ramone. Yep. And when I went and interviewed Al Schmidt a couple of weeks ago, he talked about, Tom Dowd and Phil Ramone. Yeah. Those were his mentors. And so, the reason why I bring up Phil Ramone is like Phil Ramone and Bob Ezrin are these two, because Ezrin actually was a huge influence on Jack. And if you can go back to, and actually, I believe, a year or two younger than Jack. And Phil probably wasn't that much older than Shelley and Bob and all these other guys, maybe only, less than 5 or 10 years older.
Sure.
So I think it's also important to note that there's certain personality types. Like I can't imagine, maybe I'm wrong, I can't imagine having Bob Ezrin as my assistant, even when he was 19. I think there's probably people, guys or girls, that have a natural kind of leadership role. Sure. Maybe it just happens earlier with them. Sure. And then you get other guys and other people that come up in the industry and learn and evolve. Because I don't know about you, but you obviously got a leg. You obviously started a lot quicker in many ways than I did. But I don't think I couldn't have produced a record that was worth listening to before I was about 32. I think the first thing that I did that I can go back to and go, that's a good piece of production. I did tons of stuff before that, but I wasn't ready. And there's no way you understand what I mean? I
absolutely do. Yeah. And for myself, I sort of served a producer engineer role early in my career, but mastering being a completely different animal. Sure. I can see where producing, especially, it takes a lot of maturity and it takes time, and it does take a personality. And gosh, talk about an amazing personality in Phil Ramone. Every person in the room, you know, I've met Phil a number of times while he was still alive. And every time I met him, I was just like, I feel so good just being around this person, because he just, and in a very genuine, because that's who he was, a genuine way. And I think that was one of the many things he brought to the table as a great producer.
Sure.
And as you're saying, as a great mentor to folks like Bob Ludwig, Bob Ezrin, Shelley Yakis, and Jack,
Evans,
you know, even if they were of the same, they were contemporaries age-wise, or roughly, you know, give or take 5 years or so, he just had something as a person that brought the best out in everybody around him. Absolutely.
I only met him once, and it was very short before he died, but I met him in a session. And Jack and I were working with Al Schmidt in one room, and we went in and met him in the other room, and he was recording an orchestra. And I've said it on other interviews, so I apologize for anybody that remembers this, but when we walked in, he was holding a score, and he had a pencil behind his ear, and he had the arranger next to him, and he was marking the score with the arranger. And I know I've said this before, so I apologize, but I turned to Jack and I went, "Hey Jack, that's a real producer." And he burst into tears and laughter. I just thought it was hilarious, you know, because it is like, you know, Jack and I are more rock and roll guys. And don't get me wrong, Jack is a instrumentalist and arranger himself, string arranger himself. But we have a sense of understanding, like we were talking about off camera earlier, about how some people just have an amazing positive self-awareness of their role and their understanding, and they don't take themselves too seriously.
Right.
Jack's very good at that, and that sounds like that was the only time I ever met Phil Ramone. But I think that's the other thing about Phil Ramone. And I'm sure you have, and those that haven't, read his book. It's Making Records.
You know what? I haven't read that book, and that's going right on my list tonight.
I think it's called Making Records or Making Albums. I think it's called Making Records.
It's an autobiography then, right?
Yeah, he wrote it with somebody, but it's unbelievable.
Oh yeah, I've got to read that.
And it's all just basic psychology of dealing with artists.
Yep.
I mean, it's probably the best self-help group. The thing about going to some of our greatest sort of mentors of the mentors is when they do take the time and write these autobiographies, they're great books to read on how to mature as a human being.
Sure.
And what draws us in is they're talking about something we love. So because they're talking about our industry and about music and about working with some of the finest artists and the finest arrangers and the finest studios, because it's something that piques our interest and keeps us involved, you put the book down and you realize you just had a freaking 10-year therapy session.
Right. A life lesson wrapped in what you already love, that being music. Yeah. It's pretty amazing.
So it's like, highly recommend.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll put another link to that, or link to it often. So we booked coming out here, I think in like October.
Okay.
It was a long time ago, and here it is in the frozen tundra of January of the minus teens. And we, like you were talking about, part of the job of working on bigger projects is to not tell anybody you're working on bigger projects.
Right.
When we left Bob earlier today, he's like, "Oh, I'm doing an album for your home country from a label from the UK." I was like, "Oh, cool. What is it?" He goes, "Can't tell you."
Right.
And closed the door, and it's all silent, and I can't hear anything coming out. I have no idea what he's working on. Of course, there's that natural curiosity. I just want to crack open the door and hear who it is.
Right.
But that's a big part of what you do, especially when you're working with major label artists and stuff like that. You can't let the cat out of the bag. Oh, by the way, expect a new album from, I don't know, Beyonce when you know, she dropped that album a couple of years ago without
that would get you fired.
Get you fired.
And maybe blackballed as well.
Yeah, certainly that artist and that label would never hire you again.
Sure.
So the reason why I bring that up is that anybody who's ever watched a Warren Hewitt style video knows that my favorite band is Queen, and that my favorite album is A Night at the Opera, and I talk about it all the time. And you did an amazing job, and I've not telling me that you worked on it until I opened Facebook one morning, and there is a nice picture of this cover. Notice how I have it in my hand ready to go. Of the movie, the soundtrack of the movie, and you were talking about working on the movie. And
the soundtrack, that is. I didn't actually work on the film, but the soundtrack for the film. Yes. That's right. Yeah.
And well, did they use the masters in the movie?
Not that I'm aware of. And I don't know any inside information about it, but if you read about how they built the audio in the movie.
Yep.
There's some interesting stories, like for one, how they did an amalgamation of Rami Malek's voice, with Freddie's voice throughout the film for all of the performances that happened.
And some with Mark Martel as well.
I believe so, yes. Yeah.
I'd heard that as well.
Yeah, so maybe they used some incidental, I don't know. They never told me. But my work was specifically on the soundtrack album. That's right. Yeah.
Which I am holding here.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely fantastic.
And I should also say that there's about a third or so of the album are from the 2011 remasters that Bob had done, which was also my first work with Queen, in that Bob remastered the catalog in 2011. And with each studio album, they included a secondary album of unreleased material that was of the same time frame.
Sure.
And that's what they had hired me to do, was all of that work that then led to subsequent work, including this, as well as the Queen on Air box set that came out a few years ago with all their BBC performances.
Oh, yeah, I have it. Yeah.
And the News of the World.
Yeah.
What anniversary was that? 30th? I can't recall. Came out last year.
Yeah, it was 78.
Yeah, so it'd be 40th, excuse me. Yeah. Where they had me. Yeah. Holy moly.
When I get old.
So I've had the fortunate, I've had the fortunate.
No, that was 77, wasn't it? Because 78 was jazz.
Okay.
78 was jazz. And then they didn't put an album out in 79, and then 80 was the game.
Okay.
But they had the single, came out in 79. Yeah.
So then in 2017, they released a box set, 40th anniversary box set of News of the World, which included Bob's 2011 remaster of the album proper, and then 2 or 3 CDs worth of other stuff. Different mixes of the album, different performances of the album, live performances, all this other cornucopia of really cool stuff that they had me master. So when it came time to do the soundtrack, it's in part compiling some of the tracks from Bob's 2011 remasters and then mastering all of the other stuff that's on there. There are live performances. There is a Smile version of, I can't remember which song. There's some other new mixes of some of the hits, and a whole bunch of other things that I mastered.
Is it Doing All Right? Is that what it is?
Oh, it might be. Yeah. Doing All Right.
I'm looking at all the titles here.
Yeah. So last year, and I probably finished it before you and I spoke in October, but last year I'd done the mastering of this soundtrack. But of course, we never talk about anything until there's a street date, until the marketing hits. Yeah. I also was really pleased to see when they started marketing. They started marketing the soundtrack around the time they marketed the movie, and they released the soundtrack prior to the movie by several weeks. And they included myself and Bob in their marketing as the mastering engineers, which we don't always get that in marketing. We very rarely get that in marketing. So that was really nice to see, because they are also one of my favorite bands as well.
So about a year or so ago, we were talking with Howie Weinberg, and he said that the golden era for him, frankly, was like mid to late 80s through like the 90s. Sure. He did so many transfers from tape back to CD because, what was mastered for vinyl in those days did not translate at all to CDs. Right. Although there was a lot of misses, wasn't it? There was a lot of times they would take like the vinyl master and use it for a CD. Right, or a safety copy of a recording of the mastering and just transfer it to CD and then put it out there. So now we have this sort of like whole other aspect now where people are listening in a completely different way from even CDs. Mm-hmm. There's no more traditional kind of like CD player and hi-fi at home. I go to people's houses all the time that have no hi-fi, but they do have a way of playing music. It might be one of those little, I don't remember half the names, one of those little kind of like circular bows kind of things. I see all kinds of different ways. And so now we have this massive challenge where you have to keep, and you were saying to this to me off camera, keep the integrity of the original recordings. Luckily, like you're saying, a lot of this you'd already done with Bob, obviously as the mastering engineer, but you're going back and you're trying to find this place where you can keep the integrity of the original recordings. Then, like the live stuff, like I'd love to know specifically, like Keep Yourself Alive, the live one there. Like how do you make it work in a modern world, and at the same time keep the integrity of the original recording? So when a ultra fan like me, which I am, puts on a pair of headphones or sits in a listening environment isn't completely confused that now there's this massive extended low end that never existed on my vinyl or even the CD, quite frankly.
Right.
You know, from, I think the earliest Hollywood record ones, I don't know who did those. Who did the earliest ones?
That I'm not aware of.
Yeah.
I'm
You
not
know,
sure.
so there's been all these different iterations.
Mhm.
So how do you preserve, and I know you know my question, but I'm just articulating
Sure.
for the audience, you know, how do you preserve the integrity of make people still believe they're listening to those original mixes, those original experience they had, like I did as a kid with a gatefold sleeve and a pair of Sony headphones on in the 70s, but still make it translate to the modern world?
That's a great question. And I would say every remaster can be a little bit different. And often maybe possibly driven by whoever we're interacting with, whether it's the artist, the original producer, and what they're looking for. You know, occasionally it's make it completely different and modern and don't pay attention to what came before. That's very rare, but occasionally that happens. Mostly, if somebody sends me a remaster, and funny enough, I just did a whole bunch of remastering at the end of last year and the beginning of this year for a number of different artists. Oftentimes what I would do is I would always buy the original record. I would listen to that as I'm working. I'd get a feel for that relative to the flat unmastered mix files, which I'm provided with. If it was something originally on tape, I love to get the tape because, as we talked about on camera earlier, the notion of being able to play through our signal path, choose one of the 3 different EQ curves in terms of playback electronics, right off the bat can make an enormous and positive difference. So get as close to the source mix as possible. If that was tape. If not digital, that's fine too. Compare that to what the world has been listening to for years. Respect that, and then have an innate sense of, in respecting that, how can I make it better? And that, again, can also be driven by whoever's involved in the remastering campaign. It could be the artist, it could be their producer, it could be an engineer, it could be the record label, saying, just make it better, or make it that much more modern, or make it as close to what it was with more detail as possible, which is oftentimes very easy, especially with an analog tape and my signal path here. Sometimes I put the tape up and immediately start hearing details that were lost in translation the first go around. Occasionally, because of the tech that was taken by the original mastering engineer, more often than not because of early technology that did not expose those details. So oftentimes if I've done a remaster, and I hear back from the client, and I love to hear back from the original producer or engineer, if they say that they're hearing more of what they remembered hearing in the studio than they've ever heard on any release, then I've really done my job. Then I've been able to bring out the details that, you know, especially with the LP format, there was so much lost in translation from the mixtape to a vinyl record. And if you talk to a lot of those engineers and producers, there was always a bit of a letdown. Even as well done as the mastering and the cut of the LP and the manufacturing of the LP could possibly be, it never sounded like what was in the studio. So that's what I'm usually trying to achieve, is pay deference to the original release, because so many people have known that the artist approved it at some point, the producer approved it at some point. The fan base and the general public has been listening to it for years. How do you respect that, but then enhance it in the most musical and proper way possible? And so I think that's the best way I can explain it. The Queen thing was a little bit unique in the sense that those handful of studio tracks that came from the 2011 remasters, we have that archived. I just pulled those up and plopped them in along with the other 2/3 of the record that I was mastering and made them all live together, which is, of course, a big part of what I do. Beyond affecting each individual song and recording, as we were looking at it as an entire album, how do I make all the Live Aid tracks, how do I make them live with Bob's 2011 remaster of Bohemian Rhapsody, the song, you know, and how do you make those all hang
Were those
together
all, those were already mixed, all the Live Aid stuff? From years ago, or had they? Do you remember off the top of your head?
I don't remember off the top of my head. My guess would be that there was a current remix of them.
Oh, okay.
And I bet that the liner notes explicitly say one way or the other. But this is the first time those Live Aid tracks have ever lived as an audio-only format anywhere, which is that was really satisfying to work on this. Because I remember that. I remember that performance. I remember that being a triumphant performance for the band. And I remember it being really exciting and going back and taking those mixes and mastering them for this release was really fun.
Absolutely amazing. So, also off camera, you had said to me that that's these kind of situations where you're trying to preserve the integrity of it. This is a situation where you would probably work hybrid.
More likely than a new first run master that I do in the box. And often I want to say that it's twofold. The reason for that is twofold. One is that, I mean, in some instances, you may want to go back to some of the original EQs, which we have an equipment room here with a cornucopia of great stuff.
We saw it, and Bob was like, "It's a mess. I don't want you to film it." You know,
sure.
But just we pulled out the Neumann EQ from the Frank Zappa story, and it's great that you kept that stuff for this reason.
Yeah, because there are some things that immediately. No matter what you do, there's nothing that sounds like a certain EQ or a certain compressor of a certain vintage. And just as an example of that, many years ago, probably, 10, 15 years ago, I did a few remasters for the Rolling Stones. And I was, again, paying deference to the original recording, listening to it as I was working. And I had a sense in my head where I needed to go from the tape to what had been done originally. But no matter how I turned knobs in certain EQs, I couldn't get there. And then I thought, you know what? This Sontec EQ was used by every mastering engineer on the planet for many years. By the time I came into my own as a mastering engineer, these were just sitting in our equipment room. And I went and grabbed one and started dialing in what I thought needed to be done. And amazingly, it just all started falling into line because the Sontec had been the EQ that originally had been used. And I kind of fell in love with it at that point and made it. It wasn't in my rack. I tore out whatever was here and put it in its place and started using it in general. When I was still using a hybrid path very regularly, I started using it just all the time.
Is this the Q, the 5, 6, 9, 11?
That's 15? The Q. That's right.
Oh, okay.
Yep, that's the Q. So it's a parametric equalizer. It has shelving EQs, both high and low shelving EQs. Then 3 bands of parametric with a Q, and certain frequencies that you can choose as your center frequency. And it's just broader and different than any other parametric EQ I had heard. So that's one reason why I might go back to the hybrid signal path doing a remaster is, well, there are certain things that are going to get you there pretty quickly in terms of sounding like the original recording sounded like. And so maintaining that integrity and then making it better. Also, I find, even if that's not the case, with some of this Queen stuff, I found going back to the hybrid signal path, there's just something about it. I don't know how to describe it aside from the fact that I could dial things in faster that made sense to me and made musical sense to those recordings of that vintage.
Sure.
Utilizing some of my analog equalizers as opposed to trying to do it all in the box.
You know, then there's probably, somebody asked me the other day, how do you get an AC/DC drum sound?
Right.
And I said to them, and then talk about classic AC/DC, I said, use, they're mixing in the blocks. So I was like, use like API, Neve, especially Neve, not that all their stuff necessarily mixed on a Neve. I was like, because, 60 hertz is probably what was boosted on that kick.
Right. And 60 hertz on that Neve EQ sounds different than 60 hertz anywhere else.
Yeah. And of course, every emulation is slightly different, but it's going to get you closer because as you're saying, there was certain stock is probably the wrong word, but certain pieces of equipment that high end, this is a very expensive piece of equipment back in the day, very expensive still now, that, yes, like you're saying, it's the initial shelving is 50 and 100.
Those are your only two choices.
Yeah. So, for vinyl, I'm sure they were boosting 100 more than they were boosting more than 50. It really
I would guess, yeah.
And, on the top here, What have you got on the top? Oh, it's not shelved on the top, so you've got a Q on the top there.
There is a high shelving. I can't recall what the shelving frequency
I see, yeah.
is,
so
but
it's just fixed.
It's just fixed. Just boost it or cut it.
Wow.
And there's nothing else that sounds like it. So, yeah, there's certainly, you're right. If you want to get that AC/DC drum sound, aside from hiring Phil Rudd to play the drums, you want to go back to the technology that it was of that vintage and is very unique, and otherwise nothing else sounds like it. So for the very little bit of remastering that I do, that's why I end up going back to what I used to do for everything, the hybrid signal path, because I can choose these colors that are indicative to that vintage recording.
Sure.
And that can get me there not only more quickly, but again, maintain the integrity of that recording.
Right.
Otherwise, like I said with the Stones thing, I was turning knobs, like thinking, okay, well, I think it needs more of this, this or that, highs, lows, mids, wherever the center frequencies felt in my head.
Right.
When I would try to dial them up on anything else, it wasn't quite sounding the same.
Right.
But then I put the Sontec up and I started dialing those same frequency ranges in, and it started to lock in and feel like that, because that was what was, the original mastering engineer had used on the
That makes
record.
perfect sense.
So it makes a lot of sense. So that's where I go back to the hybrid path a lot, is when those remasters come up. Excuse me.
That makes perfect sense. Now, while we're here, let's look about what else you've got here. So you've got an SSL compressor here. Are you, if you're going to get a situation where maybe you've got a ton of fishtails, like peaks, are you basically, because I know a lot of guys are telling me they're doing increasingly less compression and more limiting more than anything else.
Yeah.
Is that when you're getting something that you think hasn't been compressed enough yet?
It's a very broad stroke of compression.
Right.
That piece of gear gets very little use, even when I am working hybrid, because it's a much broader stroke of compression. And yes, to your point, it's, there's no magic secret sauce for anything. So it's with that being a more broad type of compressor. If it's something like you said, a lot of fishtails, a lot of high peaks and low lows, and it wasn't compressed enough, then I might go for something like that.
Right, I see.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the SPL Tube Vitalizer?
Yeah.
That's adding what?
Excitement? It has a number of different ways where you can do harmonic enhancement, of which I very rarely use it. This one actually has a little secret sauce in that this knob is a stereo width enhancement.
Oh, wow.
And more than anything, that's what I use this one box for when I use it.
Is it an MS? What is it doing?
I'm not sure what is happening under the hood.
Right.
I don't think it's a true MS circuit. I've never been a fan of MS processing.
Nor have I, no.
It never seems to come back right to me.
Yeah.
And most of the mixes I get are already sound. Yeah, exactly. And virtually all the stuff I get already sounds really great. There's still a lot of room for me to do creatively what I do to it. Mm-hmm. But whenever I've used MS on mixes that are sent to me, because they already sound so great, MS always seems to do something gnarly so I've never liked it. So I don't know what they're doing under the hood. They have something very specific, but it does a nice, very subtle width enhancement.
There's so many questions I have, because I'm thinking about that. Then I'm thinking about conversations I've had with mastering engineers about the low end.
Sure.
About how now with dance music, because one of the problems for dance music is, and I get these things sent to me to mix, and there's a stereo bass. And what does stereo bass means? It means they just flip the polarity. So there's like barely anything, if at all, coming out the middle. It's got this one, 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 one bass doing this. And the problem is like that will not go on, sit on vinyl. The stylus will just jump out.
That's right.
So do you have any, what a lot of guys are doing is that maybe it's on plugins increasingly these days. They're basically taking, I don't know, I'm going to think of a number, maybe a couple of hundred hertz and below, and making it mono.
Right. Maybe so. I honestly haven't come across that very often.
Oh, you haven't?
Thankfully, I haven't, because virtually everybody is doing at least a short run of vinyl of their record these days. And I can't think of a time where I've had to deal with it, but that is how I would deal with it. Yeah, absolutely. Because you need to have it center. And I'd also say that even in the digital domain, I would definitely recommend try to keep that low, especially the low sub energy, as much center as possible. Right. Because not only will it affect a vinyl record of which you might sell hundreds or thousands or something. More importantly, I've heard that negatively affect a lot of consumer playback systems in the digital domain as well, where things get really gnarly and weird. And, a lot of these consumer devices now are using some amount of DSP before, and don't get me started on not liking that. But the point being that if you have a lot of out of phase, low frequency information in your mix, then even when you're playing it back digitally on some sorts of consumer devices, something's going to go wrong. Something's going to get a little gnarly. So I would steer clear of that. Fortunately, I haven't seen very much of it in the mixes that I've gotten over the years. But if I did, that might be how I'd try to attack it.
Well, I think we're sort of, with a lot of the, especially lower cost consumer stuff, like the $100 all-in-one box that's going to play back your music that's this big, they're most likely using DSP to overcome the fact that they would need to keep the hardware costs down. So if they've got a little driver which is this big, and they've got to figure out how do you reproduce kicks and bass lines and stuff like that, they're going to be coming up with all kinds of tricks. And DSP is a great way of like, let's boost this frequency and cut that one to make it feel like there's more low end than there really is.
Right. It's a low cost means, as you said, of overcoming the hardware itself.
Because once you've designed the DSP, that's a bought and paid for thing. Right. Where the hardware has to be continually
are much cheaper than building bigger boxes with big drivers and good voice coils and the whole thing. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, no, and you know what I think that it's interesting, I think as a side note or certainly in line of this thinking is that the concept that you and I think probably came up with, I always feel like I feel very fortunate that I got to see the tail end of how we used to make records in the analog domain and the beginning into today of how we make records in the digital domain. There are a lot of principles of engineering that haven't changed or needed to change in a long, long time.
Right.
And some of the basic principles of engineering that if you adhere to still make for great records today and make also for great consumer playback across this broad swath of consumer playback devices that we see today. And one of those things is this concept of keeping things sounding really great in mono.
Right.
That there are a lot of engineers that I've studied over the years, going back to being a young engineer myself, and in reading interviews with them or seeing interviews with them, and they would always talk about building things in mono and making sure it worked there first, and then creating stereo from that. And I know that's an old school method of doing things that goes back to a day when everything was released in mono, but I firmly believe that there's something to that's really important that makes for great stereo playback.
I think it's like when we're going back to talking about, we were talking about how there's that sort of growth as a musician.
Sure.
That you go through the technical and you love the technical players, and you should do. And then you come out the other side when you've got a certain level of technical ability. And like in anything you do, once the technical ability becomes there, then you can move more into the making music.
Right.
You can stand back and listen to things more as a whole. For you, I'm sure, it's like once you learned what the benefits of different, whether it be plugins over hardware or different pieces of hardware versus different plugins, different lists. Once you've learned those things, then you can spend more time actually, using those tools rather than just using those tools because it's the one you're now learning.
Exactly. And there's a lot to be said for that in terms of your headspace and creativity.
So I think, it's the reason why I bring that up is because I don't know many mixers that even bother checking in mono.
Sure.
However, they grew up learning how to work in mono.
Yes.
So they now have the acquired knowledge that they don't make those mistakes.
It's a really great point. So they don't need to do that.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of a double-edged sword because I get a lot of people asking me the mono stereo question.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, yeah, but I saw an interview with Crystal Algae and he says he never checks in mono. And I think even Andrew Shep said something like he rarely ever checks in mono. And it's not because it's not a necessary thing to do if you're year 2 of your mixing. You're only a couple of years into learning how to mix. If you're in that early stages, sure, check in mono, because then you're going to learn that, boosting low on this side differently to low on that side may cause all kinds of havoc.
Right.
Like I will do stuff to my guitars, but then sum them and then treat them together. Treat them together so that there is a consistent low mid coming out on both sides. Right. You flip that back into mono. If I've treated them with 2 different plugins in 2 different ways, little phase and polarity issues. I never know what the right thing to say is, so I always say both. Phase, polarity. I don't know. Because if I say it in wrong context, I'll get something. He meant phase and he said polarity. He meant polarity, he said phase. And I do.
It's all time domain stuff.
Time domain stuff. Yeah. So I think, do you... are you waiting to hear a problem before you check, or do you initially always just check?
Well, so, I mean, I don't, and much like what you're alluding to with Andrew and Chris, is that it's inherent, like, they've done so much work and they're so seasoned, they don't necessarily need to check it, and they'll know if they have a problem otherwise, right?
Yeah.
I occasionally check in mono. Now, that said, in mastering, I can't do a heck of a lot to change what's happened, but where mono comes for me is, or where I'll check it, and normally I already know the answer, it's just a double check, is if I put something up and something is wildly out of phase, I should say, immediately I go to mono and be like, oh yeah, that instrument disappears when I go to mono.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I can't fix it at that point. But if the mixer were to ask me, what do you think? I might say, well, in the future, you should be mindful of this, and here's why. If one thing that happens not often, but maybe more often than anything with this type of issue is, as you mentioned, guitars. If you use some kind of effect, take one rhythm guitar and make it super wide and stereo-ish, when you sum it to mono, the guitar almost goes away.
Yeah.
Because it's all a trick of phase. And all the
I
phase
talk about it a lot. The MS
Yeah.
stuff, that's where it really falls apart. And then, I don't know, Haas effect.
Haas effect, sure.
Yeah, I always, when I talk about if you are forced into using that, I always tell people, do two things to it. Delay it, also pitch it.
Sure.
If you can pitch it slightly flat or sharp, or even irregularly pitch it, like with some kind of chorusing, once it goes back into mono, you're less likely to have that cancellation.
Exactly, because the frequency response of each channel is different as opposed to being exactly the same and then canceling out. Yeah. And so what I find happens in that case is, well, you sum it to mono, and so now your rhythm instrument is gone.
Yeah.
And what if the artist licenses it to a film?
Sure.
And it ends up being a mono thing for some reason. It's not the grand stereo end credits thing. It's a point source in a scene of a film. Or even worse, folks are listening at home, as you mentioned, those small devices like the Sonos and the Boses of the world. A lot of those are in mono. Sure. And so if somebody's listening, and a lot of people are listening that way, then go to the grocery store. The overhead speakers are in mono. Sure. You've lost your harmony instrument for the sake of having this thing that, to my ears, when I first hear it, usually jumps out at me as, oh, that's some phase-induced effect that sounds kind of lame in stereo, and then goes away in mono. So it's something that I think that I can't change in mastering, but for mix engineers, it's something to be aware of. That there's an importance in making sure that it will work in mono for a young or new engineer to really tie themselves to for a little bit. And again, as you said, the seasoned engineers of the world, they already know it and it's already inherent. That's like folks asking me, do you take your masters out to the car and into other, I know the way this room translates so well. Did I do that at one point in time? Absolutely. When I first started out, I would do that a lot, and I'd bring in NS10s and I'd go out to the car and I'd listen at home and, a boombox or whatever. But I've worked in this room and I've worked as a mastering engineer my entire adult life. Early on, I got to a point where I know how it's going to translate outside of this room. So I don't need to do that, much like what you're saying about seasoned engineers with mono. But for younger mix engineers or mix engineers starting out, there's something that's really important to that. And I think we got on this discussion by starting to talk about MS and our mutual dislike of it, because it often does something phase-wise that is a I
also
negative.
feel like all of those things are solvable in other ways.
Sure.
Like, if you high pass your guitars just right, and you keep it so there's some body from the low mids, but not the super, super lows, they're definitely going to feel like they're left and right.
Right.
But if you've got
You're
too
not gonna get
much,
that phantom image sort of
so you've got too much low mids, like super stodgy low end, it's going to sort of feel like it's sort of in the middle. But if you can just high pass it enough, just find that sweet spot, they'll suddenly be like left and right. Like, well, left, left and right.
Right. You're on the left.
My other left.
Stage perspective.
Yeah, stage perspective. Exactly. Yeah. But so it's that sort of thinking, and I think a lot of stuff is not talked about enough.
Sure.
And is confused. But then I think that's also because, like we're talking about, like a lot of information out there is being doled out by people who are, like I was just saying, there's your learning curve, and they're here on the learning curve teaching, and they haven't come out that other side yet. They're the technical, learning the technical still, So there's I see a lot of that stuff. So let's go back to the gear stuff. You've got the SPL console here, the Master View, which we touched on a little bit as for your monitoring. This is presumably so. You can, I see. So you actually already have it labeled as the equipment that's in it.
That's right. So this is the SPL Master Bay. It works in conjunction with the console, and essentially this is hardwired patch bay. And if I want to dial up the Manley Massive Passive, I just choose the Manley Massive Passive. If I want to use the GML, I choose that. Or if I want the GML before the Manley for some reason, I just do it that way. You can see there's a number that shows up here.
That's great.
And then you can store up to three presets, so to speak, while you're working. So it's just essentially like a really convenient, really well thought out patch bay for the analog side of my signal path.
Great. Okay, so here we've got. What do you? Bob was saying he works exclusive at 85 dB. That's where he lives. Are you doing that as well, presumably?
Same place, 85 to 90 dB SPL.
Right.
While I'm working, I feel like, given the way our ears work in the Fletcher Munson contours, that number one, that's a place I always listen for that reason, and I think it's where we hear most linearly, and then it yields, I think, the best result outside of the room and in different playback environments. And then, of course, that's been internalized in me now for so many years. We internalize what good sound is and at what sound pressure level we like to work. And I feel that that's the place where I work best, certainly when I'm making sonic decisions, EQ decisions, I should say.
That's great.
And that sort of thing. I might turn it down a little bit when I'm editing and doing tops and tails and that sort of thing. But that's certainly where I like to listen when I'm doing all the creative work. You've
got all your speaker, you've got 3 levels of dim, which is nice.
Yeah. It's great. Somebody comes to the door, buzzes me over the phone. I can just, if I'm printing something, just dim 30, talk for a second, put it back up.
Nice. You can also just kind of hear what it sounds like in different levels. And
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I find for me, I go to the dim quite often just to make sure my mix sounds good. What I mean is like balance-wise.
Right.
Like I'll go that, and I hope that the vocal is sticking its head out nicely. But if I've done that and the vocal's not sticking its head out nicely, I'm like, oh, okay.
And you know what you need to do. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what sound pressure level do you like to listen at? What is your go-to?
Well, 85 is where I've tried to live my whole life.
Sure.
But I find that when I'm mixing, I mean, Eric will tell you, I'll go loud.
Okay.
And then turn it down and work super quiet, do detail stuff much lower than 85.
Sure.
Rather than being consistently like at 85, I listen super loud for short spurts. It's like, does it feel, am I excited? Is this blasting?
Yep.
Yeah. And then I'll come down and go, no, I need to bring up. And then I'll turn around and like everything's super low, and I'll find some high mids that need something brought out to get it more exciting. There's some energy in the guitars that are missing. And I'll turn it up to a normal level. Does it sound exciting now? You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's like I sometimes find that I get inspired by listening loud to see, am I hearing kick blasting me? I remember Dave Jordan said to me that what he loved about the Mutt Lange period, AC/DC, which is black, not just Back in Black, but Highway to Hell, which is a phenomenal sounding record, is he said it was kick, it was like stomach, chest, stomach, chest, stomach, chest. And that was like, he put that record on, mixing, I don't know, Jane's Addiction, Alice in Chains, and he wanted to hear his kick and snare do that same thing.
Sure.
So, and you don't get that when you're like, we can talk all day about, the great guys like Andy Wallace who mix super low, and obviously the guy's a genius and for the detail, but you still want that visceral, like emotional effect. So for me, it's like I listen super quiet, normal, and then brief spurts of super loud.
Sure.
I just want to be blown away, So,
sure.
Anyway.
And we all have what we internalize and what we really like in that regard.
Yeah.
You should stick with what works for
you.
You.
And I think that does come down to that emotional response of getting excited by music.
Sure.
That's why I can't imagine doing this for a living and not loving music.
I know. I've said that for years for my entire career. I feel really, this huge benefit in the sense that I've never lost my love for music, because that's why I started doing this in the first place.
Right.
And I still listen to music, on my own time. I get excited about the music that I work on every single day. I get excited to walk in this building every single day.
Sure.
And I think I'd mentioned to you that if you were here at a session and things were going well, you might catch me air drumming, and you'll certainly catch me moving around in my chair. That's when I know emotionally everything's working and the job's almost done. But that comes from my love of music.
I agree. Okay, so what you got going on there? What's that Dolby spatial processor? Spectral push.
Another harmonic, almost like an oral exciter sort of thing.
Right.
That does not see very much use these days, and hasn't for a bit, but it's been on my rack forever. It has sort of 3 bands of choosing places to create harmonics that otherwise aren't in the recording. So I can't really speak too much about it because I haven't used it in a bit. Back in the day when I used it, I'd go for a little upper mid-range excitement with it.
Right.
But gosh, I don't think I've turned those knobs in, I bet, a decade or so.
Well, then I'll take it off your hands.
Right.
see if I can find use for it. The Transient Designer, is that just when something's come in so bricked wall that you're just trying to see if you can pull something out of it?
Yeah, or something.
Or even the opposite. You can crank up the sustain a little bit and try and...
Right. But more so, if something came in dull.
Right.
Because as a transient designer, it allows us to build a tack.
Right.
And add. And so that's not appropriate for probably 9 out of 10 things that come through the door. But if you get a mix that's a little mushy, a little dark, lacking transient response, it will help add it back in. And they also make a plug-in version that's really nice.
Right. Yeah, I've used the plugin. It's fantastic. Yeah. And then underneath, we have the GML.
The GML, yep. So these, I would say, and I've said this before in a number of different venues, these are my two favorite equalizers in the analog domain, and then their digital counterparts are also my two favorite equalizers, and they are very different from each other. So the GML is a parametric equalizer, and that allows me to do a lot of different things. I could probably get most jobs done with a GML equalizer, just finessing it in different ways.
Who makes the plugin version?
Massenburg does.
They make their own?
Yeah, they make their own. The MDW is what it's called.
Yeah.
And it is just this fantastic parametric equalizer, that does everything from low and high shelvings to broad strokes of parametric EQ to sharper cues, and allows me to do a lot of different things. But mainly, I'd use it in a more, what you might call more surgical mode, fine tuning. Real fine tune equalization. Whereas I'd go for something like the massive passive for those broader, more musical strokes.
And Bob was saying that sometimes he just puts it in line.
Sure. It has a sound.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a subtle sound, but it has a thing that happens just when it's not in bypass, it has a thing that happens. But when you start turning the knobs, it's just really musical. It does some really cool things. Yep. If you're looking just on a link tip, if you're looking for something to link to, I was profiled for Manley's website. I think it was last summer. Yep. Pretty easy to find if you just Google my name and Manley, where I talk a little bit more about this EQ and how much I love it. Right. So it's usually, in terms of equalization, it's more often than not a tandem of those two things. Sure. Fine tuning, broad strokes, musical broad strokes of EQ with the Manley.
I love going to studios that have them. Yeah. And I'm just like, if I've got really an ugly tom, like an ugly tom, and I'll just throw it on the mix through that and just really have some fun with it.
Sure.
It's good from a recording and a mixing perspective.
Right. A lot of folks use it in the recording and mix domain, and mastering folks really got into it many years ago as well. But it's a tool that spans all three disciplines.
Even makes great stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really, really great stuff.
Absolutely.
So I suppose we talked briefly about the Ampex.
Sure.
And I know Bob has two downstairs. I think he has. You have three, don't you? Because you have 1 inch, half inch, quarter inch.
Yeah, we actually have a total of. Let me think about this. I believe we have 4 ATRs, if I remember correctly. Two of them are capable of going from quarter inch to 1 inch. The other two are quarter inch and half inch.
Right.
And they also vary in terms of the playback electronics. Like I've mentioned a few times, this has 3 sets of playback electronics.
Wow.
We have some other variations on the ones that are downstairs. We also have a couple of Studer A20s as well.
Right.
Ampex machines tend to be our preferred machine, but we have the Studers if we want to use them, which have, of course, a different color and a different feel from them all together.
Is that going to be in a world, for instance, I like this sort of detail. So is that going to be in the world of like you get a European album in, where they may not, this wasn't common.
Sure.
When I was a kid, I go to studios, there'd be Studers and Revoxes.
Sure. So absolutely, if it's a European album or if it's a domestic American album but has been mixed to Studer,
right,
and it feels as though the best thing to do is play it back from the same machine it was mixed to.
Right.
But even in that case, in the days of getting a lot of analog tape, which are almost gone now, but in the days of getting a lot of analog tape, we still felt as though something, hey, you recorded this on Studer and you let us know that, it still sounds like better playback from the Ampex.
Right.
To our ears, at least.
Sure. They might
but we have all the flavors just in case we need them.
Right, but they might be coming to you for that very reason.
Sure.
They'll choose you because I think it's a combination. I feel like humbly believe that the best mastering engineers are capable of doing the two extremes, which is A, having a sound when necessary, and B, not having a sound when necessary.
Yes. And that's musical maturity as well that we've touched upon a few times. Is if you get something that already sounds so amazing and you don't need to do anything to it, you have to have that musical maturity to say, oh, hands off, I'm not going to do anything. Yeah. That said, most of what we get, there's room for us to be creative and to do our thing, but ultimately to serve the music in the best way possible. Right. It's never, I don't like to think that I have a sound, but I know I have a feel and I know I have a creative bent and I know I have a way of doing things that is probably somewhat unique to other people. But with all of that said, the concept is that I'm not trying to do it to impart my sound to something. It's my way of making an artist's record sound the best way it possibly can.
Totally.
And people come to us, I think, for that reason, for what I do and for what Bob does. They like it. And it's very respectful to the recording itself, and always very respectful to, and I keep alluding to a musicality, but there's a lot to be said for staying very musical in what we do. And that sounds like, well, of course that's the case, but I don't know that that's always the case.
Yeah, I agree.
That's something that we work very hard at.
Right.
Yeah.
I've noticed obviously from a perspective of, producing and engineering and mixing my own stuff, when I've had various different people do it, I've noticed that I've ended up gravitating towards the philosophy of lots of strings to the bow, as opposed to this is my sound. I feel like the problem for that is like, I can't remember how many conversations you and I have had where I'm like, was there any problems? And most of the time, hopefully, thankfully, you'll say, no, there wasn't.
Right.
But I actually want every now and then to find a problem so I can get better.
Right. And that's, and kudos to you, because I think that that's what the best engineers in the world do.
Right.
And I have this conversation with a lot of other clients as well. And I'm always happy to provide, constructive criticism and feedback. Is like, if this was something was a little dark, had a little too much, whatever the case might be for any given project, because I feel as part of the production team, that's also part of my role, not to lord over what anybody else is doing, but just this is what I'm hearing in my home base where I'm working every day on a cross section of recordings. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. We're all always learning.
Well, I think that, and also the reality of this as a career for me, because there's some stuff that you would have mastered for me where I was spending $1,500 a day in a really beautiful studio, and my assistant was as good an engineer as I am, probably a house engineer. Like I was talking earlier with Bob, that Olga Fitzroy is the house engineer, but also an independent engineer recording orchestras for Hans Zimmer. And you might go in there one day and maybe, I don't know if she still does it, but there's probably was a period of time when she was your assistant.
Right.
But also could record the London Symphony Orchestra on her own. And so that's a different feeling to say when you mastered like Chase, that artist who was 19 years old, and we did it in a day in my studio, with 4 mics on a drum kit. I'm playing all the instruments, he's playing guitar and singing, and I'm playing like piano and everything, and I'm recording and mixing it. We'd do it in one day, come back the next day, play in the mix, and then we'd send it off to you.
Right.
So I am looking to you in a much, much different way than the song I produced and engineered at expensive studio mixed by Fred Famous.
Right.
So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there is no one size fits all anymore. Not that there always was, but there was definitely a time when the budgets were always there, and the level of, if I was going to a smaller studio, or people were going to smaller studios in the 90s, they were doing it because they wanted that sound. Let's go and get like a little tight 4-mic drum kit in a little room,
Right.
Nowadays,
or they were going for a vibe that was outside of what they were used to doing. And
But now we're in a smaller studio, and this is the reality for everybody in the smaller studio, trying to get it to sound like they're in the $2,000 a day room.
Right. And that's where I think that I hope that I can help benefit the clients that I work with that much more. And one thing that I've found since that change in paradigm many, many years ago is that clients rely on me more. And I, and I welcome that, because I want to be as much part of the team as possible. That's, I feel when that is the case, that I'm being even more helpful in those ways where I can, provide feedback. And also, if you're doing all those things you were doing, not only working with maybe a smaller budget in a smaller studio, you're also, in that case, you were wearing 3, 4, 5 different hats. You're a producer, performer of multiple instruments, engineer, mix engineer. Outside perspective is helpful, and that's one thing that is a mastering engineer.
Quite often, we're also songwriters. We're also co-writing, because you've got a young artist coming in who's maybe an amazing singer, has an okay song, and you've got to rework the chorus or put a bridge in there or whatever, and you become a co-writer on it as well. So, it's a lot of hats, and I think that I hate mastering my own stuff, but I have to do it every now and then.
Sure. All the best mix engineers say that, and I can see why. And it's because I wouldn't want you to ask me to mix. I wouldn't want you to even say, here's 24 stems, why don't you finish that up for me because it's a different discipline and it's a different mindset. Could I do it? Sure. But not as well as you because you're a discipline. That's your discipline is mixing, which you're really great at. And all of the best mix engineers that I know loathe mastering their own stuff. They also loathe sending it off to somebody who they have worked with before because it's their baby and they want to make sure that it's going to be handled well. But that's because mixing and mastering are two completely different disciplines and they're two different mindsets and perspectives. And so it's a team effort.
Mastering, yeah, absolutely. And mastering also serves, we should get onto this, also serves a lot more masters. Mastering serves more masters. No, but it does. It serves more purposes than mixing.
In what way? We'll elaborate.
Well, because somebody's coming to you and going, hey, Adam, you have to mix this to be on a CD. Now, you're saying that they probably didn't use this for the movie, but there will be 1,000 other times when they will.
For the film, sure.
So I'm mixing it. Now you're mastering it to live in, I mean, these days it could be living in Atmos. It could be living in 5.1, 7.1, 11.1, what is it, the Aural, all these different things that are coming up. And there's no way, Jose, that I'm going to take my stereo file and then try to figure out, how to do that. Right. So, and even if I am mixing for a 5.1, it's like, I was talking to Frank Filippetti about this a few years ago because I worked on a Korn album that he also did, and he mixed it in 5.1, and I had to make stereos from his 5.1 and also mix some other stuff. Okay. And I had to get on a phone with him and be like, how am I taking your 5.1s? Because I was working with Epic at the time, and they were getting this. It was a Korn record, and we had to get it out. And he's just like, turn this up to 1.1 above, this one down 1.2, this one pan this, do this, blah, 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 to get it summed back so it sounds like a good stereo mix.
Sure.
And it was, my point is like, that's a whole world that that mix engineers are, maybe we're being leaned on a bit to do with that, but that's, I don't know. I'm wondering where mastering is going to go for that. Whether you're going to be sitting in rooms now with Atmos speakers above you, whether it takes off, I don't know.
Right, I don't know. It's very difficult to say. And, we've done 5.1. I mean, 5.1 has been done here. Bob has done 5.1 longer than I've been here. Right. I've done it my entire career. But each year there's less and less of it being asked of us.
Right.
I think because budgets are much smaller. And, if you look back to, say, the mid-2000s, 2003, 2004, there was a big industry push for 5.1 on DVD audio and super audio CD, which happened to come, and I could see it coming. DVD audio, super audio CD with high-resolution digital stereo and high-resolution 5.1. Really exciting, really cool for us in the industry. But at the same time, the iPod and the iTunes music store were hitting, and boom, we know what won that scenario.
Sure.
And in fact, here in the United States, all the major record labels stopped releasing SACDs and DVD audio discs. It's very niche stuff now, niche stuff. So I don't know. And so you add Atmos into the realm, you add 7.1 and all these other formats. I haven't seen the call for them yet.
Right. I know it's early stage. I was talking to Steve Jenwick. I think they're like 100 songs in. I mean, it's early. I think they've done the Carpenters. They were mixing the Beach Boys.
Okay.
Like that with the London Symphony Orchestra. It was unbelievable to hear. What do we call this? Immersive audio.
Immersive audio, exactly.
It's going to be the future because they're going to design systems that we're going to hear like that. But
well, and that I think is the crux, and that's where I think that would be the tipping point, is designing a system that's relatively easy for the consumer.
Sure.
Not that the consumer isn't sophisticated and can't figure things out, but they're not enticed. They weren't, 15 years ago that enticed to build 5.1 systems at home in home theaters, or encouraged to, or didn't have the desire to. So that's, if we can find something, people talk about immersive audio with something that goes on your head, that would be relatively simple and brings this amazing experience to the home, then maybe that is the case. Yeah. And maybe theaters are going to start using their theaters for audio only type events that would add to, what they're already doing. And that makes sense. But right now, 99.9% of the work we're doing here at Gateway is stereo with the occasional 5.1. 10 to 15 years ago, we were doing 5.1 almost on a weekly basis.
Right.
And every year it's been a little bit less, a little bit less, a little less. I hope that changes because it's a fun format, and it's very exciting as a listener to sit back and listen to music that way. But I just haven't seen it go that way just yet.
So I remember 10 years ago, was it even 11? But I think 10 years ago, when mastering the Frey album with Bob, having an experience I could never have before, like being in a room that good. So the one thing I learned about, the most important thing for mastering, is the monitoring.
Absolutely. I consider that the most important thing, certainly for mastering, but for anything.
For everything. Yeah.
For anything and everything. You know, if a young aspiring engineer asks me where to spend their money, what plugins to buy, what devices to buy, I say focus on your monitor path first. Because if you can get, true picture of what you're hearing, then your work is going to get that much better, exponentially faster.
Both you and Bob are also in amazingly well acoustically treated rooms, which is another whole day we could talk about.
Right.
Was this designed by the same guy as that did Bob?
Yes, absolutely. So the design was by Peter D'Antonio of RPG Diffusers. Right. He designed both Bob's room and this room. This room was designed to be just a smaller version of Bob's room. Though if you get a good look around the room, it's as big, if not bigger, than all of our competition's main rooms or mastering rooms.
Sure.
So it's a big room, but Bob's room is enormous, right?
Yeah.
So the ratios, the acoustic design, everything is the same. And the concept is neutrality. The room should be extremely neutral. We want to hear the tape as it sounds coming off the tape without the room imparting sound and color. Same with whatever's getting played off of a hard drive. We want the room to be as neutral as possible, which includes the speakers. It's the whole system.
Sure.
The monitor path, the cables, the power amplifiers, the speakers, but most importantly, the room. Because a number of folks have used these speakers before and have done things electronically to make them work in a room. And these
what are they?
They are Duntec Sovereigns.
I don't know.
They're an Australian speaker. Duntec is an Australian company. Bob started using these speakers in the mid-'80s. Making a huge adjustment or change in the way mastering engineers monitored, moving into mastering engineers using very neutral audiophile type speakers. They just they're super neutral. They're inviting to listen to. The clients come in and what they always say is that if anything, they want to come for the hang so they can hear their record in a way that they're never going to hear it after leaving the room, which is the speaker, the room itself, and all the components that make up the monitor path.
Wow. It's amazing. And are these self-powered or do you have separate
powering? Just behind you
Yep.
is a cello duet power amplifier that drives these speakers.
Is that the same as what Bob uses or is it something completely different?
He uses cello amplifiers. He has a number of them to power those Egglestons downstairs.
Yeah.
But yes, the same technology, cello technology for powering these speakers.
Now you're saying with the Dynaudios, you're not using them as often?
No, the concept with the Dynaudios, we talked a little bit about surround sound.
Right.
The one difference between the rooms, aside from the size of the rooms, is that we have this room set up for stereo and Bob's room set up for stereo in surround. So when I do surround mastering, I just book a date in his room and that works out great. And especially considering the surround work is unfortunately fewer and further between these days, it's always worked out fine. We bought the Dynes originally as a reference speaker so that if I mastered 5.1 in his room and I wanted to come up, edit it back to picture, if it had a picture component, or just do the final editing, or just listen in a different space, we had them set up. Now, we don't have them all set up at the moment. The center speaker is down. The surrounds are in the closets in the back of the room. But that's all I really use them for. So it's the the Duntec Sovereigns that do all the work.
So there's a symmetry to them.
Absolutely. Tweeters in the middle.
Yeah.
These dome tweeters, and then it's symmetrical all the way out to the subwoofers. Wow. The other thing that's unique, and actually I believe is patented, is the felt on the speakers itself for damping. I believe no other speaker manufacturing can manufacture speakers with felt on them if it's not a Duntec product.
Wow.
And that, again, works as damping. It helps, keep the woofers from resonating in one way or another outside of...
I'm going to let you guys know, after we've done this, we're going to fire up the Bohemian Rhapsody soundtrack and have a quick listen.
Yes.
Can't put that on camera. First of all, it won't translate because all you're going to hear is this little tiny thing here. So that's obviously the first thing. But the second thing is like we don't want to be demonetized by playing somebody else's music. That's amazing.
Yeah, I love these speakers.
I have a big question for you.
Okay, shoot.
In the 21st century,
Yes.
In the
which is
2019.
where we are living now.
Right. I shouldn't date this with 2019, but we'll have 11 months of it. What is mastering now? What is it? What is the job? I mean, obviously, look, we all know it was vinyl, taking a mix, making it work on vinyl. Then it was remastering for CDs. Then it was this, that, and the other. But the reason why I say that is it's not just a final process of like, here's a stereo file, oh, couldn't I have done that on my master bus kind of. And it's now, well, I mean, it's future-proofing, it's this, that, and the other. What is it for you? When you get something, what are you really doing? What are you ending up doing?
It's a great question. So I think it hasn't, there are a number of ways that it hasn't changed in, say, a decade or so.
Yep.
Or maybe most of my career, which is over 20 years now, in that it's a creative, sort of the last creative step in the process of making a recording. And if anything, I feel as though I'm relied upon to be more creative in 2019 than maybe in 2010, than in 2005, so on and so forth. So if you look at the history of mastering, it started out, as you mentioned, how do we get what's on the tape to a record, to a lacquer, to then be manufactured for LPs that consumers can buy. And it was more of a technical process. How do we get it from one place to another? And then mastering engineers, starting in the 60s and into the 70s, of Bob and his contemporaries, turned it into a more creative process. I feel as though, if anything, we are called upon to be more creative than ever in 2019, and possibly so moving forward, which has been the case most of my career, but it's just more of it. How can we take the mixes that are given to us, respect the integrity of the mix? If it's already great, be mature enough to say it doesn't need a lot or anything. But most of the time when you get a mix, how can you take it and make it sound that much better? So it translates to the consumer. It translates across many different platforms. Okay, we're in this fractured internet world with many different distribution means. Gosh, here in 2019, almost all of our clients are doing a short run of vinyl. They're certainly going to continue to do short runs of CD. Downloads may disappear before anything else, in my opinion. They have, the sale of downloads, and I think rightfully so, precipitously gone down. All of the various streaming formats. So on the back end of what we do, we finish out the creative process. We start the means of manufacturing and distribution. We do many different formats leave here when they go to the client. But it's not changed what we're doing creatively too much, okay? So again, if anything, we're being asked to be that much more creative in this part of the process than ever, and which I welcome and which I enjoy very much so. And we're asked to create a number of different types of distribution means or formats. And so that's where I see mastering in 2019. How can we service our clients to be as creative as possible? We talked earlier a little bit about how much we've seen change in our careers in terms of the making of a record. Smaller budgets in smaller studios. Unfortunately, a lot of these great historical large commercial facilities have gone out of business. We're relied upon, I feel, even that much more because of that. Because I work in this same room every day, what is a very neutral room that allows me to hear a mix as it's been mixed without the speakers or the room or anything else in the room coloring it. And it becomes a home base sonically for my clients. So I think that's where we're at, is we're relied on that much more. We can be that much more creative, and we're relied on to be that much more creative. And then we need to understand the end user formats.
Sure.
Very well. Our clients expect that of us, that we know what needs to be provided for all the different means, these fractured means of distribution that exist now in 2019. Now,
absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. But you are having to future-proof as well. You're having to sort of think about this, because I've been to a bunch of AES meetings where it's been very heated discussions, shall we say, in the Sportsman's Lodge in Los Angeles, where we've got rock and roll guys, pop, R&B guys, all, music guys.
Sure.
But then we also have audio engineers that are working in film and TV.
Sure.
And they are being told, but in their world, that everything has to be at 96K.
Right.
That they want X number of different kinds of stems because they've got to basically be, they've got to make music available for all of the different listening environments, which go far beyond earbuds and stereo speakers and even mono speakers.
Right, absolutely.
So how much of that are you being called upon, number one? And number two, how much do you anticipate that growing?
Well, so to answer number one, what we've been doing and what I've been doing for years and years and years is always mastering at the highest res that is given to me. And that is...
But what about, sorry to interrupt, what about upsampling? I mean, they're giving you 48K.
Sure.
Are you saving it at 96 as well?
I'm not. And the reason being is that there's not a huge benefit in upsampling. Back when I was doing a hybrid signal path almost all the time, and given that I'd be going out analog, I would usually upsample or recapture at a higher sample rate.
Yep.
And I did that for many years. And I think we were doing that before anybody else, where we were mastering everything at the highest res possible, always 24-bit. The client might call 4 or 5 years later and say, "Oh, we'd really love to release that on HD tracks. We probably need to hire you to remaster it." And we can usually say, "No, actually, we did that at the highest res possible then. We can unarchive it. We can create a new deliverable for you, and it will be a lot more cost effective than remastering it." So that's where we're future-proofing, in that mastering everything at the res that it comes in at. So if you give me something 4824, I'm going to master it 4824. If you give me something 9624, I'm going to master it 9624. If you give me something 19224, I will master it 19224. And that future proofs us in that realm. Now, if for some reason you wanted to upsample something, we could always recall the 4824 master in the future and upsample to 96. But really what should have happened in the first place was it should have been mixed at 9624 to get, of course, the benefit, or tracked for that matter at 9624. My understanding is that all of the major record labels here in the US now are, and the Recording Academy and the P&E wing of the Recording Academy, are saying that they want everything done at 9624. More importantly, the record labels, because they would, make the contracts with the record producers and the engineers. That said, I'm certainly not seeing everything at 9624 yet. See a fair amount at 9624, a little bit at 192, but the vast majority still at 44.124, 48.24. And again, whatever sample rate and bit depth you give me is how I'm going to master it, and then how I'm going to archive it and how we can recall it in the future if need be. So that's really the future proofing for us. I would like to think that all of our colleagues and competitors, or all of our mastering brethren, are doing that now. But I know 10 or 15 years ago when we first started doing that, very few were. Most were still doing 44.1 16-bit mastering, or at least their end result was. So that's our future proofing. And where do I see it going in the future? That's a good question. And I'm not sure that I know beyond where we are at here in 2019. I'm not quite sure I know where we're going to go in the future. I hope to see more 9624 recordings and mixes come across my desk than I've seen in previous years. And of course, I will be mastering them that way and then be able to provide them to the record label, to whoever the client is, after we're done mastering, and have it archived for future use. Beyond that, I'm not quite sure. We could be doing more surround sound, but we need to be provided surround sound mixes.
Sure.
I see us in a place where the technology is in a really fantastic place, and the creativity and the ability of the technology to allow us to be more creative is in a really great place here in 2019.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you ever so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for making the trek all the way from West Coast to East Coast to visit us.
And I didn't want to say this at the beginning of these videos, but these aren't sponsored. Nobody paid for us to do this. We do this because this is important. This is really important.
Yeah, and we feel very privileged and happy to have you here. And
well, thank you.
Thank you for making the trek out and spending the day with us.
Worth everything. Just worth everything.
I'm happy to hear that, man.
Yep. And so, as ever, please leave a bunch of comments and questions below. I might try and throw you under the bus and see if you can answer some of them.
Sure, absolutely.
Sure, absolutely. You hear that?
Happy to do it.
Absolutely.
Only if you're positive.
Remember, no experts. Just, we're always learning. Thank you ever so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Leave a bunch of comments and questions below.